outgrown it. The streets, lined with the same old diners and mom-and-pop stores, carried a scent of nostalgia I wasn't ready to face. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I pulled into the driveway of the house I once called home. It stood there, a relic of my childhood, familiar yet foreign, a reminder of everything I had left behind. The project was straightforward. Renovate the family home before it crumbled into a memory. Simple on paper, impossible in reality. Every step back into this town felt like a step into a past I had carefully avoided. I sighed, cutting the engine. The air was thick with the late afternoon heat, carrying the scent of cut grass and asphalt baking in the sun. My brother had offered to meet me for dinner, but I needed a moment alone. Or maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I could walk through these streets without feeling like I was suffocating. That's when I saw it, the gym. It hadn't changed. Same faded sign, same neon light flickering like it was too tired to keep going. My feet moved before I could second-guess myself. Maybe it was muscle memory. Maybe it was just me being stupid. The inside smelled of sweat, metal, and determination. The rhythmic sound of jump ropes slapping the ground, weights clanking, sneakers squeaking against the mats. It was all too familiar. And then I saw him. He was at the far end, adjusting a punching bag for one of the younger guys. His back was to me, but I knew. Time had changed him in ways I hadn't expected. His build was broader, the sharp angles of youth replaced by something more solid, more defined. His movements were precise, efficient, like he had nothing left to prove but still carried the instinct to fight. He turned. And suddenly I was 6 years younger, standing in this exact place, waiting for him to notice me. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a second, just a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Recognition. Surprise. Something else. Then it was gone, replaced with the kind of calm only experience could teach you. He didn't falter. Didn't look away. Neither did I. A slow exhale left his lips before he wiped his hands on a towel draped over his shoulder. Didn't think I'd see you here. His voice had changed, deeper, steadier. I shrugged, playing at indifference. Didn't think I'd be here either. Silence. A familiar one. The kind that was always too loud between us. I glanced around, searching for something to focus on that wasn't him. You own the place now? He nodded. Yeah. Got tired of leaving. Figured I'd put down roots. Roots. The very thing I had spent my whole life avoiding. Still working on that house? His tone was even unreadable. I hesitated. Yeah. Just got in today. A slow nod. I could feel his eyes studying me, taking in the years that had settled between us. I didn't give him the satisfaction of looking back. How long are you staying? Long enough to fix the damage. I wasn't sure if I meant the house or something else. A smirk ghosted across his lips, brief but noticeable. Guess I'll be seeing you around then. He turned back to his trainee just like that. Conversation over. I lingered for a second too long before stepping out into the cooling evening air. I had come back to fix things. I just wasn't sure if I was ready to face the things that couldn't be fixed. I thought I had control over how much I would see him, thought I could keep my distance, keep my head clear, keep myself from slipping back into something I had no business revisiting. But life, or maybe fate, had a cruel sense of humor. The very next morning I walked into the old house, coffee in hand, mentally preparing myself for the long list of repairs that needed to be done, but the air between us was anything but neutral. Every accidental brush of his arm against mine, every second too long of eye contact, every sharp inhale before a response. It was all there, simmering, threatening to boil over. And I wasn't the only one noticing. My brother had a way of picking up. The words were casual, but his tone wasn't. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, expression tight. You don't need to be around him. I stiffened. He's working on the house. That's it. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You know that's not it. My jaw tightened. It is for me. Silence swallowed the irritation bubbling in my throat, forcing myself to focus on the facts. It made sense, he was one of the best in town at what he did. That was the problem with small places like this. Everyone was tangled together in ways they couldn't escape. I don't want any issues, I said, forcing a neutral tone. We both do our jobs and stay out of each other's way. His lips twitched, not quite a smirk but close enough to make my stomach twist. Sure, he said, dragging out the word like he didn't believe me for a second. And why would he? Even I wasn't sure I believed myself. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, measurements, and conversations that felt like walking a tightrope. We discussed layouts and materials with the precision of professionals, but the air between us was anything but neutral. Every accidental brush of his arm against mine, every second too long of eye contact, every sharp inhale before a response. It was all there, simmering, threatening to boil over. And I wasn't the only one noticing. My brother had a way of picking up on things before anyone else did, a sixth sense when it came to people, and it didn't take long before he cornered me one evening in the kitchen. "I saw you two today." The words were casual, but his tone wasn't. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, expression tight. "You don't need to be around him." I stiffened. "He's working on the house." "That's it." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Silence stretched between us, heavy and unyielding. He watched me like he was waiting for something, some crack in my armor, some sign that I wasn't as unaffected as I claimed to be. Maybe I wasn't. But I wasn't about to let him see it. "Just be smart," he finally said, voice quieter now. "You've come too far to go back." I turned away, pretending to check my phone, pretending his words didn't hit harder than I wanted to admit. "I know what I'm doing," I muttered, more to myself than to him. But the truth was I wasn't so sure. The night stretched long, the air thick with the scent of sawdust and varnish, the soft hum of an old radio playing from the corner of the workshop, barely loud enough to register. I hadn't planned on staying this late, hadn't planned on staying at all, but somehow, the hours had slipped through my fingers, and now it was just the two of us. The world outside faded into the darkness. He worked in silence, focused, methodical, his hands moving over the wooden frame he'd been restoring for weeks. And I should have left, should have turned and walked out the door the moment I realized how empty the workshop had become, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way his jaw tightened when he concentrated, the way his fingers moved with a certainty I had never possessed. Or maybe it was the exhaustion settling into my bones, the weight of old memories pressing in too close. I leaned against the edge of the workbench, watching the rhythmic motion of his hands, the way the muscles in his forearms tensed with every precise movement. "You ever think about what it would have been like?" My voice felt foreign in the stillness, cutting through the low murmur of the radio. He didn't look up at first, just kept working, but I saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers paused for half a second before continuing. "Like what?" His voice was even, unreadable. I exhaled slowly, fingers trailing absent-mindedly over the rough wood beside me. "If things had been different. If we had been different." This time he did look up, dark eyes catching mine in a way that made it impossible to breathe normally. "I used to," he admitted, his voice quieter now, like he wasn't sure he wanted me to hear it. "But thinking about something that never happened doesn't change anything." A bitter smile pulled at my lips. "No, it doesn't." For a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching, charged, heavy. The radio crackled softly in the background, a song I didn't recognize fading into another. "You regret leaving?" he asked suddenly, his gaze never wavering. I hesitated, the answer tangled somewhere between truth and self-preservation. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But I regret staying more." He studied me, his expression unreadable, and I hated that about him, hated how he never let me see what was really going on beneath the surface. "And you?" I pressed, my voice sharper now, a challenge. "Do you regret staying?" He let out a slow breath, setting down his tools before leaning against the opposite end of the workbench, mirroring my stance. "Every damn day," he said, and there was something raw in his voice, something that made my pulse stutter. "But I regret letting you go more." The words landed between us like a live wire, sparking, dangerous, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the air too thick, too charged. I straightened, my hands gripping the edge of the workbench, the sudden need to leave crashing into me like a wave. "I should go," I said, but I didn't move, and neither did he. His fingers brushed against mine, the lightest touch, barely there, but it sent a jolt straight through me. I looked up, my breath catching, and I saw it, the same thing I had been trying to ignore since the moment I walked into this room. The weight of everything we had never said, everything we had never done. I should have pulled away, should have stepped back, but instead I did the one thing I knew I shouldn't. I closed the distance. The first touch of my lips against his was tentative, hesitant. But the moment he responded, it shifted, deepened, became something neither of us were ready for. His hand moved to my waist, fingers pressing just enough to make me aware of every inch of space between us disappearing, and I let myself get lost in it, in the warmth of his mouth, in the way he tasted like something I had been craving for too long. But then too soon, it hit both of us at once, the reality of what we were doing slamming into us like cold air against heated skin. We pulled away at the same time, breathing hard, eyes locked, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he took a step back and I turned away, grabbing my coat, my fingers trembling more than they should have. "I should go," I said again, and this time I did. I threw myself into the familiar, into routine, into the safety of what I knew was right. I spent mornings pretending I hadn't felt his hands on my waist, afternoons convincing myself the taste of his mouth wasn't still lingering on mine, evenings sitting across from my partner, smiling at the right moments, nodding at the right times, answering questions with just enough warmth to make it believable. I told myself the kiss was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things, but every time I closed my eyes I was back in that workshop, my fingers tangled in his shirt, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the hum of the radio. I thought distance would help, thought if I just focused on what mattered it would fade, but it didn't, and no matter how much I tried to pretend, my body betrayed me. My hands shook when I reached for my coffee in the mornings, my pulse spiked every time my phone buzzed, my breath caught when I caught sight of him across town. He was everywhere even when he wasn't. At the house he was careful, professional, distant in a way that should have made it easier, but it didn't. He never touched me, never stood too close, never said anything that could be taken the wrong way, but the way he looked at me when no one else was watching. That was the problem. It was in the way his gaze lingered a second too long, the way his fingers tensed when I walked past, the way his jaw tightened whenever I mentioned my partner's name. He wasn't unaffected no matter how well he hid it, and knowing it worse. My brother noticed. He always noticed. "You've been off," he said one evening, watching me too closely as I washed the dishes. "Something's different." I forced a laugh, forced a smile, forced the lie out like it wasn't suffocating me. "I'm fine." He didn't believe me. I could see it in the way his brows pulled together, the way he hesitated before speaking again. "Are you?" The plate in my hands nearly slipped. I gripped it tighter, nodding too quickly. "Yeah. Just tired." I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. I needed to erase him, needed to silence the echo of his voice, the weight of his hands, the pull of something that shouldn't have been there in the first place. I told myself it was just a mistake, a moment of weakness, a glitch in my otherwise structured life, and the only way to fix it was to drown it out with something real, something solid, something safe. So that night when my partner leaned in, fingers brushing my cheek, I let him. I told myself I wanted this, that this was exactly where I was supposed to be, that this was what love was supposed to feel like. Steady, comfortable, predictable. His lips met mine, soft, familiar, but the moment his hands slid down my back, the wrong name flickered through my mind, unspoken but there, burning, unraveling everything I had tried to hold together. I pressed in harder, desperate to push the thought away, to replace it with something real, to convince myself that this was right, that I was still the same person I had been before that damn kiss in the workshop. My hands curled into the fabric of his shirt, not out of passion but out of panic, as if holding on tighter would stop my mind from betraying me. But it was no use. The taste of him wasn't his, the warmth wasn't his, and no matter how much I tried to sink into it, my body refused to forget. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and for the briefest second I hesitated, my lips faltering, my grip loosening. He pulled back slightly, eyes searching mine. "You okay?" The concern in his voice made it worse. I forced a smile, forced a nod, forced the lie to sound convincing. "Yeah. Just tired." But I wasn't the only one who noticed something was off. The next morning, over coffee, my best friend studied me with the kind of sharpness that meant she wasn't just making small talk. "You seem different." I shook my head, forced a casual laugh. "I'm fine." She didn't blink. "You're lying." My grip on the mug tightened, heat pressing against my palms. "I don't know what you're talking about." She exhaled slowly, leaning in. "I think you do." I held her gaze, steady, unreadable, the way I had practiced in the mirror. "There's nothing to tell." But the way she looked at me said she already knew the truth. It started with excuses, small, harmless justifications that made it easier to pretend we weren't doing exactly what we both knew we were. The house needed more work than expected. The materials were delayed. The contractor needed updates. There was always a reason, always something that required me to be there when he was, always something that kept pulling me back into the same space as him, the same air, the same impossible tension that neither of us acknowledged but never seemed to fade. I told myself it was just work, that we were just being professional, that none of it meant anything, but every time I caught his gaze lingering too long, every time I felt the brush of his arm against mine, every time my pulse jumped at the way he said my name, the lie became harder to hold on to. The conversations shifted, slowly at first, carefully towing the line between casual and something else, something heavier. We talked about the house, about repairs, about what needed to be done. But then, without warning, the words would shift, the air would shift, and suddenly we weren't talking about the house at all. He asked if I was happy. I hesitated before answering. I asked if he ever thought about leaving, about starting over somewhere else, anywhere else, and the way his jaw tightened told me he had thought about it more than he wanted to admit. I told him this was a mistake, that whatever this was, whatever it was turning into, it couldn't happen. He didn't argue, didn't push, didn't try to convince me otherwise. He just looked at me, the weight of his stare pressing against my ribs, burning into my skin, making it impossible to breathe, impossible to move, impossible to do anything but stand there and feel everything I wasn't supposed to feel. We never talked about that night in the workshop. We never mentioned the kiss, never acknowledged the way the air changed whenever we were alone. But we didn't need to. It was there, always there, thrumming beneath the surface, waiting for one of us to break. I told myself I couldn't. But the more I saw him, the more I let myself be near him, the more I knew it was already too late. Neither of us stopped it because neither of us wanted to. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed, before the stolen moments and lingering glances turned into whispers that reached the wrong ears. My brother was the first to sense it, the first to watch me too closely, to catch the way my hands tensed when his name was mentioned, the way my voice wavered just enough to be suspicious. He didn't confront me right away, didn't need to. His silence was louder than words, his presence heavier, his eyes sharp and waiting. Then one evening, as I was gathering my things, he cornered me in the hallway, his expression unreadable, his voice low but firm. "End it," he said, not asking, not suggesting, ordering. My stomach tightened, my pulse spiked, but I forced my face into something neutral, something steady. "There's nothing to end." His jaw flexed, his patience thin. "Don't lie to me. I know you and I know what this is." I wanted to argue, to push back, to demand how he could possibly know anything when I barely understood it myself, but I didn't. Because the truth sat there between us, thick and undeniable. "You don't get to tell me what to do," I said instead. Both knew it. Then came her. My best friend, the one person who was supposed to be on my side, the one person I thought would understand, except she didn't. She saw the cracks forming, saw the way I was unraveling, and instead of standing beside me, she stood against me. "This isn't you," she said, her voice edged with something close to disappointment. "You're making a mistake." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I don't need a lecture." But she wasn't done. "You think you're in control, but you're not. You're going to wreck everything." Her words hit deeper than I wanted to admit because a part of me knew she was right. I tried to walk away, tried to shut it down, tried to stop. But stopping meant letting go, and letting go felt impossible. I told myself I would end it, that this would be the last time, that I would walk away before it was too late. But every time I saw him, every time his eyes locked onto mine, I knew too late had already come and gone. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself that walking into that workshop again was the worst possible thing I could do, that nothing good would come from it, that I was already standing on the edge of something I couldn't take back. But the moment I saw his name flash across my phone, the moment I heard his voice low and steady, saying he needed to show me something, I was already reaching for my keys. The excuse was simple, just work. Another restoration detail. Another decision that needed my input. Another reason to be alone in a place where I had no business being alone with him. The workshop smelled like sawdust and oil, dimly lit except for the glow of the lamp over his workbench. He stood there, sleeves pushed up, the sharp lines of his forearms flexing as he adjusted something in his hands. My throat tightened. I should have left. I should have turned around the moment I stepped inside, but then he looked up, his eyes catching mine with that same knowing weight that made it impossible to move. "You're late," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I wasn't sure you'd come." After a long period of home renovations, my nephew finally got himself a brand new high-powered drill. He proudly showed it off, claiming it was the latest model with maximum torque. I barely listened, nodding as he talked about the specifications, about how this was the best drill money could buy. "You should try it," he said, handing it over. My fingers curled around the grip, the weight of it solid, familiar. Curious, I decided to test it out. Taking it in my hands, I inserted the bit and, bringing it up to a screw, turned it on. The powerful motor whirred to life, and the tool effortlessly drove the screw into the wood. Definitely powerful, I thought, impressed with my nephew's purchase. But I barely heard him after that, because when I turned, I saw him standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. My partner. Everything froze. The moment stretched unbearably long, thick with realization, thick with the kind of silence that said there were no more excuses. He had seen enough. He knew. And just like that, every carefully built lie, every flimsy justification, every desperate attempt to pretend this wasn't happening collapsed. I should have spoken first, should have said something, anything, but the moment I opened my mouth, I saw it in his eyes. He already knew. There was no room for explanations, no space for damage control, no way to spin this into something it wasn't. He had seen enough, and whatever trust had once existed between us had shattered before I even had a chance to catch the pieces. I followed him home that night, my pulse hammering in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. He didn't slam the door when we walked inside, didn't raise his voice, didn't explode the way I thought he would. He just stood there, looking at me like I was a stranger, like he was trying to understand how the person in front of him had become someone he didn't recognize. How long? His voice was quiet, but the weight of the question knocked the air from my lungs. I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because saying it out loud would make it real. And then, after a silence that stretched too long, he exhaled, shaking his head. It doesn't matter. The next morning he was gone. No yelling, no last-minute pleas, no second chances. Just a packed bag, a set of keys left on the kitchen counter, and a text message saying he needed space. I sat at the table for hours, staring at the screen, waiting for another message, another chance, something that would tell me this wasn't final. But deep down I already knew the truth. Some things can't be undone. Some choices have consequences that don't leave room for apologies. My brother didn't say a word when I showed up at his door. He just stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, his expression colder than I had ever seen it. "You should go," he finally said, his voice clipped, detached. "I don't have anything to say to you." I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. "It's not, don't," he cut me off, shaking his head. "You made your choice. Now live with it." I turned to my best friend next, the last person who might still be standing in my corner. But the moment she saw me, something in her face crumbled. "I don't know who you are anymore." And with that she walked away. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. The silence inside was different now, heavier, pressing against my ribs like a weight I couldn't shake. Every corner of every room reminded me of what I had lost, what I had thrown away, what I couldn't fix no matter how much I wanted to. The space where his jacket used to hang by the door, the empty spot on the nightstand where his watch always rested, the untouched cup of coffee I still poured for him out of habit before remembering he wasn't coming back. My brother wouldn't answer my calls. My best friend left every one of my messages unread. The only person I had left to turn to was the one I had risked everything for, but even he was gone. No messages, no late-night calls, no more lingering glances across a room that used to mean something. Whatever fire had existed between us had burned out the second reality caught up to it. Maybe it had never been real to begin with. I packed without thinking, stuffing clothes into a suitcase like leaving could. Whatever fire had existed between us had burned out the second reality caught up to it. Maybe it had never been real to begin with. I packed without thinking, stuffing clothes into a suitcase like leaving could somehow erase everything that had happened, like distance could fix the things I had broken. The town felt smaller now, suffocating, filled with ghosts of a life I no longer had a place in. I drove without a destination, just kept going until the roads blurred together. Until the familiar was nothing more than a fading image in the rearview mirror. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything at all. Days passed in a haze of empty hotel rooms and unfamiliar streets, each new place blending into the next, none of them feeling like home. I thought about calling him, about seeing if there was still anything left, but my fingers never made it past opening the message screen. If he wanted to find me, he would have. He didn't. I found myself in a small cafe one evening, staring at my phone, willing it to light up, to vibrate, to give me something, anything, that would tell me I wasn't completely alone. Nothing came. The screen stayed dark, the silence stretched on, and for the first time I let it sink in. No home. No family. No love. Just the weight of my choices and the hollow ache of knowing I had no one left to